My mom tells a story of her and her friend. Let's call her friend Lisa. When my mom and Lisa were teenagers, they were up on the roof of Lisa's house, and they see a bright light in the sky. Next thing they know, the light is gone. Thing is, they think they've been on the roof for like 15 minutes, but something like 3 hours passed. My mom doesn't remember anything about what happened during that time, and Lisa simply refuses to talk about it. She would answer my mom with things like, "I don't know," and just drop it for the longest time. A couple months later, my mom moves away and loses contact with Lisa for about 10 years. She finally meets up with her again and immediately notices that something is odd about her. She appeared very distant to her and very dreamy demeanor, like she was really happy and at peace for no good reason. After they talk for a bit, Lisa brings up the incident on the roof. My mom says she still doesn't really remember anything about it, but Lisa remembers. She remembers everything. She said that at first it was all in bits and pieces and she couldn't remember any of it clearly. She was confused, scared, wanted to avoid discussing it. Then as time passed, she began to remember more of it. She remembers it all clearly, and she remembers the other 3 times she was abducted after that clearly as well. At first they paralyzed her somehow and did all sorts of invasive experiments on her, but by the most recent time they stopped probing her and began to talk with her. They didn't speak English or any other human language, but she could understand everything they said, even though she can't speak their language herself. Apparently they told her all sorts of things, stuff about space, Earth, and most shockingly predicted years beforehand that she would get pregnant in a specific year, and it would also be a stillborn, and that she would never be able to have children again. They told her it was not their fault, and they even made an attempt to save her from this fate, but they were unsuccessful. They also told her that they had abducted my mother another time after that first incident. My mom says she has no recollection of any other abductions, but she does have recurring nightmares of being abducted. But she's almost sure that they're just that, nightmares. Anyway, Lisa tells my mom that every time she speaks with them, she comes to understand the truth more and more. When my mom inquires what the truth is, Lisa just says that you'll know eventually. And she says that once she learned of the truth, everything became wonderful. My mom has seen her a few times over the years. We still live in another state from her, and apparently she has a pretty normal life and doesn't obsess over alien stuff like some supposed alien abductees do. She only ever brings it up in passing, so it's not a central part of her daily life. One night a few years back, my friend who was driving and I were taking his girlfriend home, and he decided to take the long way home. As we were driving along this fairly deserted back road, I begin to zone out. I stare at this blinking red light off in the distance and casually think to myself, I wonder when they built a cell phone tower all the way out here. Suddenly, it blinks, and it's dramatically closer than it was just a moment earlier. At this point, my friend points it out and stops in the road. It blinks once more and is directly in front and over the top of us. The red light is so bright, it floods the car in a deep scarlet hue. I lean forward so that I can see directly into the light. In that brief moment, I felt a flood of negative emotions. The closest description I can offer is to that of being naked under a giant microscope and having every pore examined thoroughly. I then look away from the light to my friend and ask him to drive. He barely responds, apparently in a similar state. Then he snaps out of it and starts driving. As we get a little ways down the road, I notice the red light isn't fading, and the interior of the car is still clearly lit by it. I look out the window and to my horror, the light is following us and does so for approximately 1 or 2 miles. The light unexpectedly veers off to the left and comes down to ground level in a patch of trees adjacent to the road. My friend stops the car again, continues to stare at it, and abruptly declares he is going to get out, look at it, like he's in some sort of trance. He opens the door and I grab his arm and tell him if he does that, I will get in the driver's seat and I will leave him. We had to leave that instant. He looks at me, seems to come to, and punches the gas so hard that the tires lose traction and spin. The light remained stationary as we rode away, but I've never looked at the night sky the same. I can't say for sure what happened to me that night, but here is what I know. I was driving home for the weekend from school at Indiana University. It takes me about 2 hours to get home, and I left Bloomington around 10 p.m. At exactly 10:53, I'm on a rural stretch of the 2-lane highway I take home when I notice what appeared to be flashing lights behind me. I thought, great, I'm getting pulled over. So I turned onto the next country road about a quarter mile from where I noticed the lights. As the car came to a stop and I started to open my glove box to get out registration and proof of insurance, the lights suddenly disappeared, and no car drove past. Now here is where the story takes a turn for the weird, and I'm sure you guys will think I'm just making it all up because it really does seem like something straight out of a typical UFO movie or story. The electronics in my car started to go haywire. The radio was randomly changing stations while the volume kept going up and down while the dome light and headlights start to flicker, turn off, and back on again. This was at 10:56 p.m. I start thinking to myself that my battery must be failing or else I have a short somewhere in the electric system in my car. I lean down to pop the hood so I can take a look at the battery, and that is the last thing I remember doing. The next thing I know, I open my eyes and I see nothing but the night sky full of bright stars. It was a cold night, and it seemed like I had never seen stars that bright in my life. I sat up and looked around and saw absolutely nothing. Nothing at all. I was in the middle of a field, surrounded by corn stalks left over from the recent harvest. As I started to come to my senses, I started to freak out. Where am I? Why the fuck am I asleep in the middle of a field? Where the fuck is my car? I got up and started walking toward the distant headlights I could see from a road about half a mile away. When I got to the nearest intersection, I looked at the signs which read 350 north and 50 west. I was half a mile away from my car, which was just right off the main road. I started walking toward the headlights I could see on the main road. I can't say how long it took me to walk the half mile, but it couldn't have been more than 10 or 15 minutes. When I arrived at my car, all the lights were out. My battery had died, which struck me as odd because I couldn't have been gone for that long. I looked at my phone, which was sitting on the passenger seat, and the time was 2:17 a.m. Over 3 hours had passed since I turned off on the side of the road for the flashing lights that were behind me. I remember sitting in my car completely dumbfounded, wondering what the hell had just happened to me. After about half an hour of just sitting there, I remembered that my battery was dead, so I got on the phone and called AAA to come out and give me a jump. It took about an hour for them to get out to me since I was a good distance away from the nearest town. During this time, I just sat in silence, running through the possible scenarios in my head concerning what had just happened. To this day, I couldn't tell you what really happened to me that night. All I know is I can't think of any plausible explanation as to why I woke up over half a mile away from my car in the middle of a cornfield more than 3 hours after I had stopped. I've only shared this story with one other person. I'm sure people would either look at me like I'm crazy or they would call bullshit on the whole story, and I really can't blame them. If somebody came to me with a story like that, one that so closely mirrors the stereotypical encounter story, I probably wouldn't believe them either.